Okay, you guys are, is this on? I don't think it's on. Is it on now? Yep, it's on now. Do we want to close the doors?
I don't know.
Depends on how rowdy they are out there in the overflow room. Okay. All right, welcome everyone to the Asheville City Council, Buncombe County Board of Commissioners joint meeting. It's been a minute since we've done this, so this is very nice to be able to have this opportunity again. My name's Esther Manheimer. I'm mayor of the city of Asheville, and to my right, we have a lot of, we have our city council members. We're missing a couple today, unfortunately, and our city manager, Deborah Campbell, is here as well. I'm not going to introduce everyone. We have lots of staff in the room. Just to move this along, I'll just say a few words. First of all, I want to thank the county for having this joint meeting with us. And I also want to thank the members of HIAC, our Homeless Initiative Advisory Committee, some of which are here today. Maybe raise your hand if you are here today. Thank you. And also the Dogwood Health Trust. If you all are here, will you raise your hand? Back there, thank you. We want to especially thank the Dogwood Health Trust for funding this project and making this opportunity available for us to hear from experts about how we can best address this issue. And we did this in partnership with the county, and you're going to hear more about that. But we also want to thank all the members of our community that participated in this process. This has been a several months long process. There were focus groups and surveys, interviews, all kinds of data being shared to create this lengthy report, which we all have access to now. So thank you all for giving your feedback. Unsheltered homelessness has emerged as a national crisis coming out of the pandemic. And it is one of the most critical issues facing our community here in Asheville and Buncombe County. The city has been working hard to address this crisis. And I just want to highlight a few things that have already happened to this point. The city has created a homeless strategy division, which now has 4 staff members staffing it. And we've also have an affordable housing division, which has 2 full-time staff and an intern. Both the city and the county have funded Code Purple this year. They've increased funding for Code Purple this year, which has resulted in 105 total emergency shelter beds. And this is a 27-bed increase from the prior year. We've also leveraged federal emergency funding along with partnership funding, and the county has participated as well in funding permanent supportive housing, which is transforming the Days Inn and Ramada Inn here in Asheville to create 198 permanent supportive housing units, which are under construction now. And we are in the process of our fire department piloting a program to participate in the community responder program. So that's an exciting development, and look more for that in the coming months. So as I conclude, I just want to say, first of all, I'm grateful all of you all are here. I think this is the most folks I've seen in a long time in one room, so that's great. And I also want to thank the National Alliance to End Homelessness, who's going to be presenting to us today. So we look forward to that. And I'm going to turn over to Chairman Brownie Newman with the County Commission.
All right. Thank you, Mayor. Homelessness is an issue of critical importance to our community. When we received our homeless point-in-time count last spring, we saw that the number of unsheltered individuals had doubled since the prior year and more than tripled compared to pre-COVID levels. We know that the reasons for this and for the rise in unsheltered homelessness are complex and that there's no easy solutions. While this increase is part of a national trend, our solutions need to be matched to our particular community. We appreciate the opportunity to work with national experts to bring a systems-level approach toward reducing homelessness in Buncombe County. We're grateful to the City of Asheville and to the Dogwood Health Trust for partnering with the county on this study, as well as for everyone in the community that's taken time to participate. Buncombe County will continue to bring resources to bear to not only address homelessness, but also related issues such as housing, health, and safety. We want to recognize and elevate some of the work that we've accomplished in the past few years at the local level and which we hope to build on going forward, including, as the mayor mentioned, a significant pipeline of new permanent supportive housing units that will be coming online in the near future, scaling up affordable housing development, including the investment of more than $12 million of American Recovery Act funds for affordable housing and homelessness services, and support for the voter-approved $40 million investment in affordable housing bonds. We've also worked together to support consolidation of the 911 services and increasing crisis response capacity, including through behavioral health urgent care. The county has also placed a significant emphasis on the creation and expansion of our community paramedics approach and outreach programs, and we're grateful to all of the members of the Buncombe County team who work on that. And we're also appreciate the opportunity to work with all the partners on the expansion of the Code Purple services. We also want to recognize and support the work of the Buncombe County Sheriff's Department and other partners in the work through medication-assisted treatment and post-overdose response innovations. We're thankful to the Alliance for their expertise and guidance, and we appreciate this thorough set of strategies, priorities, and steps that give us a comprehensive roadmap that our community can take to move forward on these important issues. So thank you all for taking time to be with us today, and now I would like to turn things over to Ann Oliva and Josh Johnson with the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Thanks for being with us today, and thanks for your great work on this report.
Great, thank you so much. Hi, everybody. This is just seeing a room full of people that have this much interest and compassion around the issue of homelessness and ending homelessness in your community is just really lovely to see, and we're incredibly excited to be here today. My name is Ann Oliva. I am the CEO of the National Alliance to End Homelessness. I'll do a formal introduction up at the podium in just a moment, but I wanted to make sure that you get to meet both of us. We are going to be tag teaming this presentation today. There's a lot of content that we are going to be talking about, so we hope that folks who are at the table really make sure that you understand and ask questions when they come up for you as we go through this content. Josh?
Good afternoon. I had to think about what time it was. Well, it's a pleasure to be here and share some of this information that we've gathered. So I'm Josh Johnson, the Senior Technical Assistant Specialist with the National Alliance to End Homelessness. I go by he, him, his pronouns. And again, echoing what Ann said, we are really excited with all the multitude of voices that we've heard during this process and just the sea of faces we see in this room, all with passion to address homelessness within Asheville. And we provided the recommendations with the goal of setting a blueprint on how to do that. So we'll talk more about that today. So I'll pass it back to you, Ann.
Great. So we mentioned that we're with the National Alliance to End Homelessness. We want to just give you a little bit of information about who we are and what we do and how we do it. So the National Alliance is a nonprofit organization. We're a national nonprofit organization. We are nonpartisan. We have worked in this field for many years. I personally have been doing this work. I counted it up this morning, going on 30 years. I spent 10 of those years in the federal government. I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Special Needs when I left, which means that I ran HUD's homeless programs. But I've been with the Alliance for about 7 months, and we are just, again, very excited to be here doing this work alongside your community. We're not leading your community, we're walking alongside you, because it is really important to know that while we do see a number of national trends, Josh and I get to travel and see what other communities are doing, what's working, what's not working. But the solutions that you implement in your own community are going to be based on your specific environment and the things that are happening and the resources that you have in your own community. Our mission is simple. It is to end homelessness in the United States, and there's a beauty to that. To having a mission statement that's that simple. It means that we do our work with a very focused goal in mind. And we do that work at the Alliance really within 3 departments. I probably need my glasses, so hang on for a second because this is very tiny. Oh, so much better. So we have 3 main departments within the National Alliance to End Homelessness. The first is our Policy and Programs Division. In that division, we really work to influence national policy. I spend a lot of my time working with members of Congress and working with the administration, whatever administration is in power, to make sure that they understand what we're seeing in the field, the best practices, what the research tells us. We also have a grassroots advocacy component of that work, as well as a legislative affairs portion of that work. So the Alliance has a number of parts of our policy work that have influenced the report that we wrote for this community, because we really do lean into evidence-based approaches. I'm going to go to the bar that's on the far right next. That's our Homelessness Research Institute. You've heard me now say a couple of times that we follow the evidence, and we can't do that unless we understand what the evidence tells us. So we actually have a research institute within the National Alliance to End Homelessness that conducts evaluations of programs within communities, as well as looks at research that are done by other universities and researchers across the country. And then the team that you've had here for the last several months is our capacity building team, and that's that center bar. The capacity building team, again, walks alongside communities to implement those evidence-based approaches so that communities can really understand how to take the resources that they have and the challenges that they have and use those evidence-based approaches to end homelessness within their own communities. Josh is a key member of that team, and we love having him. I know that you all have enjoyed having him in your community. The purpose of this report that we're talking about today is really to provide you all with a broad roadmap on how to end homelessness in your community and how to set some interim goals and implement strategies that we know are effective and that are effective in other communities as well. And what all of these strategies can do is really serve as the basis of a work plan that ends up identifying sort of the due date, the responsible person or organization, and the action steps that your community needs to take to implement all of those strategies and priorities. So it's just really based on your own local environment, but coming at it, again, with the way that the Alliance thinks about this work, which is to look at the evidence, look at the policy, and walk alongside a community. And I also want to note that a lot of communities, from time to time, need specific technical expertise. And you're going to hear me say a few times in this presentation, you could potentially hire somebody to help you think through the nitty-gritty details of this particular practice or this particular strategy, or you could ask HUD to provide technical assistance, and that kind of technical assistance from HUD is generally free to the community. So before I turn it over to Josh to start walking us through what an effective system looks like, I just want to focus in on some of these key takeaways. To put my glasses back on for that. We know that you're making progress. What I didn't say at the top of this presentation that I want to specifically acknowledge, and that shows up in this first box up here. The work that you all are doing is incredibly valuable. There's already good activity underway by the city and the county and your stakeholders to move forward. We have, over the last several months, gotten to know your teams. And as I said, I do this work a lot in communities all over the country. And I want to acknowledge how passionate and compassionate your teams are, how focused they are on this work, and how grateful we are to have partnered with them as we created this roadmap together. So I just wanted to acknowledge your teams really have done an outstanding job with us over the last several months. But the fact is that you're not having the impact that you want. There's lots of good work underway, but that good work is not fully coordinated. You're not maximizing the kind of impact that you could be having as a community, as a number of stakeholders. And really, we want to talk about, and we're going to talk about over the course of this day, what shared accountability looks like between the city, the county, the continuum of care, and your stakeholders. We did a lot of stakeholder input through this process, and we just want to make sure that folks understand that. We talked to thousands of people over the course of this project. We talked with your service providers. We talked with people who were experiencing homelessness in your community. And so all of that information and what people want and need, what the strengths of your communities are, of what your community is, and what the challenges that you're experiencing are really embedded in this roadmap that we're providing you today. Most of the recommendations that are provided in this report involve the city and the county, because the city and the county are very big players in your homeless assistance system here. But really, what we're doing is expecting that a structure will be put in place and that these decisions and actions will be led and run through your Continuum of Care board. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time today talking about the Continuum of Care and what that means for this community. We want to make sure that folks really understand that an effective homelessness response system has to be led by stakeholders. There has to be clear roles and responsibilities. We need to make sure that it's fully coordinated and that you're measuring your progress along the way. So all of those pieces are embedded in this report, and you're going to see them throughout. We set out a number of strategies, priorities, and action steps for the Continuum of Care itself to use in developing the action plans that will necessarily have to be put together in order to meet the recommendations of this report. And then the last thing I want to say here before I hand it off to Josh to make sure that, that folks know that the report itself highlights sort of short, medium, and long-term strategies and priorities, but we actually pulled out a number of short-term short-term priorities that we think are most important for this community to make progress as quickly as possible over the next year to 18 months. And we're going to focus in on what some of those priorities should be. And then before I turn everything over to Josh, I want to just note some terminology things that we're going to use today. And sometimes somebody who's been doing this work for as long as I've been doing this work takes for granted that people in the community know what it means when I say somebody who's unsheltered or somebody who's sheltered, or what youth experiencing homelessness means. So I just want to take a moment to make sure that folks understand sort of that terminology. The first thing I want to note here is we will use the words experiencing homelessness or unhoused to describe people who in your community don't have a regular nighttime place to sleep. And in that category of people, there are folks who are unsheltered. That means that they're living in their cars, they're living on the streets, and you're seeing them. That's mostly the folks who are visible to you. Sometimes folks are living in abandoned buildings, maybe not so much here. In other communities, we see that quite a bit. And so they're living in places not meant for human habitation. That's what we mean when we say unsheltered. There's also a number of people experiencing homelessness in your community who are in sheltered locations. That means that they're staying in an emergency shelter overnight, or they're staying in some other temporary situation that really is not meant for long-term, for them to stay in long-term. So that's just a primer on what we mean when we say sheltered and unsheltered, and folks who are experiencing homelessness or without housing in your community. And I just want to make sure that folks at the table know, if there's any terminology that either Josh or I use that you need us to clarify for you, please raise your hand and let us know, and we will make sure that we do that. I have spent the last 30 years of my career in Washington, D.C., which is like the acronym capital of the world, apparently, and I sometimes slip into that acronym mode. So, Josh?
All right. Okay, so as Ann mentioned, can you guys hear me okay? All right. So as Ann mentioned, the scope of our work was really to look at unsheltered homelessness in Asheville in the continuum of care. But with our experience, we know that you can't just look at homelessness, like unsheltered homelessness in a vacuum, and you must look at the entire system. But before we get into like some of our recommendations and some of our findings, we want to ensure that you know what we mean when we say an effective and efficient and equitable system. It is a system that starts with the end goal in mind, which is diverting people when safe and appropriate from entering into homelessness, which decreases their trauma exposure and has been proven to ensure that resources are efficiently and effectively spent. And also, when people are housed, we are working to house them. I mean, when people are homeless, we are working to house them as quickly as possible. So communities who have done this have had a tremendous it's been a long time since I've been in person, so give me some grace. A little bit different than the Zoom meeting. But communities who have done this effectively have really focused on utilizing housing first throughout the entire system and really worked hard to house folks as quickly as possible. All the interventions in these communities and resources in these communities are coordinated towards a common goal, which is to make sure homelessness is rare, brief, and one time. That people who are in a housing crisis have immediate access to some type of resource, including a safe place to go. People are not unsheltered. People do not spend long periods in homelessness. People exit quickly and do not quickly cycle right back into homelessness. So also with implementing these goals, we have to have some system measurement to figure out how we are doing this. And also with establishing these system performance goals, it's also important to understand that these goals are also tied to funding that can increase to ensure that we have more funding to address homelessness, but these measurements are reducing the amount of folks entering into homelessness. It's increasing folks exiting out of homelessness into permanent housing, and decreasing the average length of time someone experiences homelessness in the community, and decreases the returns of folks who have experienced homelessness from entering right back into the homeless system. So other communities who've excelled at meeting these goals have had equity as its foundation, and that's racial equity. That's equity when it comes to LGBTQIA+. They've also had housing first instilled in all interventions, and I'll talk about what housing first is shortly. They have, and part of that equity is in the foundation. Folks at the table, there's folks with lived experience, right? Because sometimes the folks who have the greatest understanding of what's happening in the system are the people who've experienced homelessness. So we have to elevate their voices and ensure that they're center into the decision-making process. There's diversion when safe and appropriate, instilled at all access points of the system. Right? Access points is where how folks enter the system. So diversion, which I'll talk about in a couple slides, is really having housing-focused problem solving to see if there's any other place you can go outside of experiencing homelessness. Other practices are rapidly identifying folks who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness and quickly engaging them to connect them to crisis services and housing assistance. You have to have quick, accessible, low barriers to pathways to shelter and other crisis services with the goal of ensuring that the time in the shelter is short. So we have to have housing interventions in place to help folks exit out of the sheltered homelessness into some type of housing stability. And also that comes with rapidly connecting folks to a permanent housing intervention. So when I talk about like the system, think about it as a roundabout, right? You want to ensure that there is something, there's a laser. So you want to ensure that there's something at the very top of the intervention that decreases the inflow into the actual system flow, into the actual system, right? When folks enter into the system, there has to be interventions that help them exit out to the appropriate intervention. If one of the interventions in the system is not moving the way it's supposed to be moving, we get a stuck system. Or if we don't have the necessary interventions in the system, there's not going to be flow, right? So we have to ensure we have resources or interventions at the top to help folks from becoming homelessness, and if they do become homelessness, we have interventions to help them quickly get out of it. What happens is, if the system we don't have system flow, we see an increase or unchanging number of folks experiencing unsheltered homelessness. We see long wait lists for shelters, for housing interventions. We see a significant amount of people in the system not getting any housing interventions at all. So those are all signs that a system does not have the proper flow. So here are some of the interventions that make up our, so when I use that roundabout, I'll say like the cars are the interventions, right? So these are some of the cars that help with the system flow. A system should have homeless prevention, diversion, coordinated entry system, including an access point, coordinated street outreach, emergency, and I put effective shelter, and I'll talk about that here shortly, rapid rehousing, transitional housing, and supportive housing. With all of these having housing first infused into them, they all should be not only capturing data, sharing data, but using data to improve decisions. And also, again, having equity as the foundational piece to how interventions are provided. I'm not going to read all of these words on the screen, but you all have access to the PowerPoint to read some of these. I'm just going to highlight. So like some of these terms that we're using, homeless prevention is really something that's targeted for folks who are at risk of experiencing homelessness. And there is, when done well, there is some type of process or assessment that ensures that folks who are most at risk of becoming homelessness, if they lose their housing, can stay in housing, right? The difference between homeless prevention and eviction prevention is this is really focused on folks who are becoming homeless, right? And the issue sometimes with homeless prevention is there's not 100%, there's not a 100% key factor that would say somebody, if they lose their housing, they'll become homeless. But that's why we have assessment tools that has some sort of, to ensure that we're targeting our resources to the folks most in need. Diversion, on the other hand, is an intervention that uses some similar tactics to homeless prevention as far as having a housing-focused problem-solving conversation, but it happens at the immediate front door of the system when somebody's actively looking for shelter, actively experiencing homelessness. We're having those housing-focused conversations. That's where diversion comes into place. And then street outreach is crucial, but it has to be coordinated. It has to be housing-focused. It has to have, have emergency health and mental health services, provide consistent engagement to help link folks to crisis services and also housing interventions in the community. But I think the trick to street outreach is ensure that if we have multiple street outreach in the community, that they're all working together towards that, again, that overall system common goal. And then, so you see emergency shelter here, right? It's a short-term beds with without a prescribed length of stay, provide safety, security, and housing navigation, case management. So that's like the bare minimum of what emergency shelter is. What we're recommending to the community that will make the most impact is what we call an effective emergency shelter, right? That is a shelter that is housing focused, right? We're providing that emergency interventions of a shelter, but we're also trying to rapidly get folks into housing. Where it implements safe and appropriate diversion. It offers immediate and low barrier access. That just means people can access it, right? We think about effective shelter, you think about it like an emergency room. If we have an emergency room that nobody can access, then what is the emergency room? So the effective emergency shelter is the emergency room. You also have to utilize data. There has to, and share the data, has to utilize culturally responsive and inclusive techniques and follow HUD's equal access rule. Rapid rehousing is one of the key interventions to help that system flow. If you don't have enough rapid rehousing, which is a short to medium term rental assistance, and it's flexible, it's person-centered, up to 24 months, that serves to house people quickly and wrap them around with all the support services needed in order for them to stabilize within their housing crisis, to stabilize their housing. I'm gonna skip a couple of these, but I wanna just highlight what housing first is. So housing first is an evidence-based practice that was created because in the early 90s in New York, they had folks who are going in and out of the emergency room, in and out of jail. They were circling in and out of emergency services, and everybody was like, well, what do we do? There's people who have high mental health diagnosis, who just are the folks that everybody in the community knows. And this organization did this radical thing and provided them with housing. Then when they provided them with housing, they wrapped the services around the housing, and they found out that people stayed in the housing instead of them having to prove based off of a case manager's assessment or some type of regulatory rules from a program that they were ready to go into housing. So that revolutionized the way we address homelessness, right? So it's really about understanding that Haslow's hierarchy of need. If somebody's on that safety rung, right? This is that psychology 101, that safety rung of like, where am I going to sleep tonight? What am I going to eat? Am I going to be safe? Where I'm sitting, where I'm sleeping? You can't address some of those big picture lifetime changes, such as maybe really analyzing a budget, or really adequately attending to substance use disorders, or a mental health diagnosis. Right? The research actually found that once folks are housed and they have that very basic baseline met, that they can start addressing that, and then that's what the data has shown that. So it's based on the understanding that it's client's choice, right? It's about not putting up barriers to housing for folks experiencing homelessness, but creating actually pathways to create that sustainability and stability, I should say. So here are some of the interventions that we found in the COC. Now, these are not representative of all folks who do everything that might fall under some of these categories. There might be some advocacy groups, some other nonprofits, but these are primarily folks who were identified under the housing inventory count, and also who are funded to do some level of housing-focused these housing-focused interventions. So just some really quick key takeaways from this section. As Ann mentioned, there's some really great things. As we started this meeting, there's some really wonderful things underway. And what we're really trying to encourage is more coordination to really maximize a lot of these efforts. It's going to be impossible to end unsheltered homelessness. I mean, it's going to be really difficult to end unsheltered homelessness if the community does not have a functioning system, again, like that's clear leadership, that goes with the proper interventions that's needed to make sure their system flow, and and folks aren't doing housing-focused interventions throughout the system. And that includes, again, housing first, equity, performance measurement, and being data-driven, increasing that flow, ensuring there is flow, and coordination and collaboration amongst all parts of the system. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Ann to talk a little bit more about kind of the system governance piece.
So you've heard quite a bit now about what a system is. What are the components of a system? What are the things you need to have for a system to function well, right? You need to have coordinated street outreach. You need to make sure that folks are being engaged when they're living in unsheltered locations. You need to have effective emergency shelter so that outreach workers have somewhere to have somebody stay the night in a safe place. You need rapid rehousing, which is that short-term, up to 24-month rental assistance that help people get stabilized. You need supportive housing in order for folks who need that type of assistance long-term to be stable in their lives. So those are all the components of an effective system. You just heard Josh walk through all of those. And really, again, grounding all of that in a housing first approach, which means that you're really low barrier and you are recognizing that housing is the key component to safety so that folks can address some of their other life goals and challenges. You need to be grounded in equity. So all of those things are incredibly important. But I think the question for you all who are sitting at the table today, I would imagine, is how do you get that? How do you make the decisions that get you to an effective system? So we're going to spend the next chunk of time together talking a little bit about structure and governance. And the reason that we want to focus here for a little while is because the communities that we've seen across the country, and I'm going to give you some examples, that have the most effective systems in place, have strong leadership and strong structures that help them make decisions within the community, and that there is shared accountability across a number of different partners. So I'm going to start here and just give you the 35,000 foot view of, we've tossed around the term continuum of care a couple of times. So now we're going to drill into this and talk about what that means. In 1987, the federal government decided to start funding programs to serve people experiencing homelessness. The overall structure that Congress created is done through the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. And that actually establishes the way that the government responds to homelessness, the way that the federal government responds to homelessness. And I say that because it's important to know that there are two funding streams coming into your community that are a result of the McKinney-Vento Act. The first is the Continuum of Care program, and that's the one that we're going to spend the most time on. But for those folks in the city and the county, you're also familiar with the Emergency Solutions Grants Program, or ESG. You receive funding through that program on an annual basis. It's a formula program. But you also received a pretty good chunk of money through COVID response from the federal government. That program, just to give you a sense of scale, usually runs at about between $290 and $300 million annually. And I believe that the COVID response ESG money was about $4 billion. So you can see that there was a pretty big uptick in the investment through that program during the pandemic. And I say all of that, again, those are the two funding streams, but the Continuum of Care is the core of that program. And that program is designed to do these things. And these are all things that we're going to be talking about today. It is designed to promote community-wide planning and the strategic use of resources within a community to end and address homelessness. And when I say strategic use of resources, I don't mean HUD money. I mean a strategic use of all of the resources within a community that are available to serve people who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. It is also designed to improve coordination and integration with what we call mainstream resources. And in your context, most of the mainstream resources sit within the county, and those are things like behavioral health, mental health, substance use services. Within your community, that also includes hospitals and other healthcare services, and sometimes education services. So the Continuum of Care is meant to promote coordination between a number of bodies and create a way to plan together and to have that shared accountability so that everybody is sort of rowing in the same direction. It's also designed to improve data collection and performance measurement. We started this conversation today by talking a little bit about an effective system means that you know that it's effective because you're measuring your performance. You're measuring how you're doing against a set of goals, and we're going to talk a little bit about data as we move forward in today's presentation. And then the most important thing here, I think, is that it's flexible enough that it allows each community to tailor its response to its particular environment, strengths and challenges. And we're going to keep coming back to that because there is no one-size-fits-all approach. You can't just take what's happening in Houston and plop it into Asheville-Buncombe County and think it's going to work here. There are aspects to that you can use and you can learn from other communities and what's working and what's not. But really, the Continuum of Care program is designed to allow communities to tailor their response to what the specific needs are in their community. That program runs this, right now it's running at about $2.8 billion nationwide. So a little bit shy of $3 billion nationwide. So you can see that that's where we are focusing, and those are the requirements that really are the backbone of the federal response to homelessness. And then to qualify for funding under the Continuum of Care program and the ESG program, every community has to establish and operate a continuum of care. So we're using that terminology both to describe the name of the program, but also to describe the continuum of care in your area. Your continuum of care is the city of Asheville and the county. Many continuums are structured that way. San Diego is structured that way. King County is structured that way, where it's the main city within an area and then the county itself. And the last award that you all received from HUD through that program was just shy of $1.9 million, and that's an annual award that you all received. So I want to pause there and see if there are any questions from the table about the COC program and sort of the structure of that program.
And I would just add that currently that would be HIAC, that is our COC, just.
That's right. HIAC acts as your Continuum of Care board, and the city of Asheville acts as the applicant for HUD money. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in the next couple of slides. Any other questions from the table? Okay. So a continuum of care, what HUD requires for folks to create in order to access this particular set of funding is a community planning body that coordinates all of these activities, both homelessness activities and homelessness prevention activities, in a self-determined geographic area. I just mentioned that your geographic boundary is the county, but it includes the city. In other communities, it can be a state, it can be a number of counties that band together as a region, or it can be a standalone city. I grew up in the first continuum of care in the country, which is the District of Columbia, and that is only the city of Washington, D.C., rather than a region. And the COC has three main responsibilities. It has to operate itself. It has to designate and operate what I would call the backbone of your homelessness assistance system in terms of data, and that's a homeless management information system. Every community, there's between 350 and 400 continuums of care nationwide, and every single one of them has a homeless management information system, or HMIS, that collects information about people who are receiving services, about the programs that provide those services, and about what the needs are of the people who are coming into the system for assistance, and uses that information in order to evaluate how your programs are doing, and enumerate the number of people that are experiencing homelessness, not just at a point in time, but over the course of a year. So homeless management information systems and the data that they produce are incredibly important to understanding how your system is functioning, whether that flow that Josh talked about is working well or not working, and where you're stuck. If you are stuck anywhere, where those sticking points are. And it can do that both at the project level, so an individual organization can look at their own data and understand how they're performing, but the system can also look at the data and understand how the system is performing. And let me give you an example of what that might look like and why it's important to have both of those levels. It is often a program will report their outcomes. Let's just say program A reports their outcomes and is looking at their data, and they're seeing that they exit, it's a rapid rehousing program, they exit 95% of the people in that program to permanent housing, and those folks stay and to permanent housing. And they think they're doing a great job. And in fact, it sounds like they are doing a great job and probably are doing a great job. When you look at that data from the system level, you can actually see what happened to those folks who exited to permanent housing and measure how many of them come back into the system over time. And let's just take this example one step further. So let's say that the system folks are looking at the data and they see of that 95%, a large number are returning to homelessness. That means that there's a problem that project couldn't see themselves, that can be seen at the system level, and then you have the opportunity to actually go and intervene and fix whatever that problem is. That's why data is important. That's why HUD requires a homeless management information system. And then, of course, the third major responsibility is doing planning. All of that planning about the homelessness response system that Josh talked you through, that gets done within the continuum of care. So all of those three broad categories include a number of very specific responsibilities that are enshrined in the law or in the statute for the Continuum of Care program and carry through the rest of HUD's funding. And I know this is tiny, and I, again, took off my glasses, so we'll work from the screen up here. The Continuum of Care has to establish a board. HIAC acts as that board right now. It actually has to identify who's going to submit the application for HUD funding. The city of Asheville acts in that capacity right now. They are called the collaborative applicant, and they submit the funding package to HUD every year. They have to develop a governance charter which shows who is responsible for what and really identifies those roles and responsibilities within the continuum of care, so everybody is clear about what they're doing and what their partners are doing. They, again, have to establish and operate the systems that act as the backbone for any good, effective homelessness assistance system. We've already talked a bit about HMIS and why that's incredibly important, but the other piece of that backbone is really your coordinated entry system. Josh talked a little bit about that, and that is your access points. How do people enter into the homelessness assistance system? How do they get assessed? And how are they triaged for the right kind of intervention based on their needs? That's a coordinated entry system. They have to create and enforce written standards, again, so everybody in the community knows what they're supposed to be doing and what they're working towards and who has what piece of the puzzle. Establish performance targets. We talked about why that's important. So the COC has to establish performance targets, and they're going to use that information when they submit funding requests to HUD every year. They have to consult and coordinate on the emergency solutions grants funding that I talked about earlier, and develop a plan for the community. It's a heavy lift. It's why structure and governance is so important. So next, I'm going to give you some examples of how other communities structure their continuums of care. Houston, Texas is widely regarded as one of the most effective COCs in the country, and it is very much tied to how they are structured and how they make their decisions. Houston was probably one of the first communities in the country to end veteran homelessness. They've made a lot of progress on chronic homelessness, and they have been working a lot on unsheltered homelessness recently. So this structure has been really important for them to have in place, and it has a number of organizations and entities that are involved. They are a city county. So when I say Houston, Texas, what I actually mean is the city of Houston and Harris County. So they are the same as you all, where they have a county organization, they have county government involved, and they have city government.
Where is their COC housed?
Their COC is housed within a nonprofit organization that acts as both the collaborative applicant and basically staffs the continuum of care. So that's the Houston Coalition to End Homelessness.
So not under the city or the county, but in collaboration with?
That's right. So, and the city and county have seats on the Continuum of Care board. So you can see the way that they're structured here. They have they have a steering committee, which is their primary decision-making body. The nonprofit has a representation there. Their local university that helps them with their data analysis and crunching has a seat on that steering committee. Some of their key stakeholders or key providers in the community have seats. A person or people with lived experience of homelessness that can really say what's happening within the system, have seats. And that steering committee, that primary decision-making body, has a number of planning and implementation bodies that report to them. And these are not bodies in word only. They are actively working these issues that they are responsible for. So you can see here on the left, there are a number of standing committees that are really in place all the time to monitor the systems that they need to have operational in order for their continuum of care to work. So that's making sure that they're getting provider input, making sure that their data is solid, making sure that they're getting input from people with lived experience of homelessness, their coordinated entry system, and their domestic violence coordinated access system, which sits alongside their coordinated entry system. I will say that after Hurricane Harvey, I had the chance to go down there and sit with this continuum of care to rapidly rehouse. You know, at its largest, they had a shelter with 10,000 people in it. And by the time I got there a few days after the hurricane, there were probably 6,000, 5,000 people. We used this structure in order to rapidly rehouse folks who had lost their housing after Hurricane Harvey. So it can be expanded and contracted based on need.
Could you clarify the staffing structure that supports this, and if that staff are all the staff members of the nonprofit that you named as the anchors?
Yes, so the staff members that support the continuum of care sit at the Houston Coalition to End Homelessness. Operating the continuum of care is not the only thing that the coalition does, but it is a core component of their work. So they submit the application to HUD, and they staff and make sure that all of the notes are taken and the kinds of things that need to happen for cross-sector communication throughout this structure happen. So they're not the decision makers, though. They are just making sure that the decision makers have the information that they need in order to make good decisions.
Thank you.
It's a great question. Thank you. And then you can see that they have decided that the way that they want to be structured is that they have implementation bodies and planning bodies with specific types of oversight where they need it, and work groups that support those bodies on populations. So they have one on chronic homelessness, they have one on veteran homelessness, families, and youth. And I forgot to tell you what I meant by youth when I teed it up earlier. When we talk about youth and young adults, we're talking about young people aged 18 to 24 who are experiencing homelessness. And you can also see that chronic homelessness, that's led by the mayor's leadership team. That's the oversight that has been created. But the work groups, which are the providers in the community, are feeding that sort of that structure, that mayor's leadership team.
And just for clarification, they have a strong mayor system.
Yes, that's right. They have a strong mayor system. Another city-county structure that I just wanted to quickly show you all. San Diego City and County is one continuum of care. They are a little bit bigger than you all. They have a number of additional cities within the county that are not the city of San Diego, so it's a little bit more complicated in terms of the politics. But you can see here that they have, again, an advisory board at the top. They have an executive committee that really is the day-to-day operation. The organization that runs this continuum of care is the Regional Task Force on Homelessness, and that is a nonprofit organization. They have standing committees based on what their priorities are. So you can see governance, making sure that their governance is always solid and that they are making tweaks to it as they need to. They've decided to have a standing committee around evaluation. That means that they look at their data every single day. And if you go to their website, they actually post live data every day for the community to look at. That all runs through the continuum of care. And then over there on the right-hand side is the Veterans Work Group. That's in part because right now they have a goal to end veteran homelessness. That is one of their primary goals as a continuum. So they have a standing committee that supports that work. And then they have a number of ad hoc committees that are created based on what the changing needs in their environment are. So you can see that they have an ad hoc committee right now that's very active on addressing homelessness among Black San Diegans. They have one on aging. We know that the population of people experiencing homelessness across the country is getting older, so this is an emerging issue. So all of these are sort of emerging issues that they want to make sure that they're paying close attention to, and they have the ability through their governance structure to create these ad hoc committees to address them, then dissolve them. Their standing committees are the ones in blue.
For communities our size, about 270,000, have you found the best path forward to be to look at these larger models and kind of figure out a local version of that works structurally and in terms of capacity, or?
I think it's really helpful to look at how other models are set up, and this one is probably the one that's closest to you all in terms of scale and in terms of setup. But it's also quite structured. I'm sorry.
Before you go to Spokane, on the San Diego, again, where's the COC housed? Is it a nonprofit entity?
Yes, the
Also?
Regional Task Force is a nonprofit entity. They actually started as a quasi-government, and they were a joint powers authority when they were first established, but they decided to become a regular nonprofit organization over time. And then for this one, Josh knows this one a little bit better than I do. I haven't been to Spokane recently, so I might have to send questions over his way. But what you can see here is this is the Spokane City and County Continuum of Care. They have their Continuum of Care stakeholders at the top and have a board. The COC collaborative applicant is the City of Spokane. So that's, again, sort of closest to the way that you all currently operate. And they have a number of committees that are standing committees, their executive committee, their data and evaluation committee, their planning and implementation committee, and something else that I can't read either here or there, which means I need new glasses. And then RFPs. That's right. That's their how they get their funding out the door. Thank you very much for that assist. And then you can see that they actually show on this, unlike the other two, that they actually show on the side of the Continuum of Care board how that board is expected to coordinate with both the city and the county. So they're very deliberate about how that coordination and collaboration happens and why it happens. Josh, did I miss anything on that?
Yeah, and that one is housed within
The city of Spokane.
I would just highlight that it's still under the COC governance structure, right? So, I mean, I think the collaborative applicant, as you see under the COC board, the city is still it still serves as that function, but it's still governed in it works on behalf of the overall community of care board, which is staffed partly by the community of care stakeholders. So.
And all these committees are not, I think that's a really important point to make. In all three of these examples, the committees are not the organization that staffs it. The committees are made up of your community stakeholders. So they are your local university folks, they are your service providers within your community, they are faith-based organizations, local businesses, folks who have an interest and some expertise to bring to the table for those subcommittees are the folks who make up the subcommittees. And they can be staffed by an organization that helps manage the continuum of care. But again, that organization is the Regional Task Force, for example, in San Diego, is not sitting on all of those committees.
And I've got a question for you before you go to
Yes.
our own. Understanding the point of those slides is to show us examples of a top-down structure. Are those communities also examples you would highlight as places that are spending adequate local dollars on the problem and proportion to the quantity of homeless persons they have and building adequate quantities of shelter beds and homes in
Yeah, I get tripped up a little bit by the word adequate because I don't think in any of these communities they have the amount of resources that they actually need in order to end homelessness. What I would say is the investment by the state, city, or county differs among all three of these. And the one that probably is the most robust, I think, is San Diego. Their housing authority actually leads a lot of their work locally and provides a lot of housing resources into the system. That said, both the county and the city have, over the last 3 to 4 years, really ramped up their investment on the shelter side, on diversion, as well as on through the Housing Commission to provide additional permanent, affordable housing resources. So of all three of these, I think probably San Diego is most robust. Houston also has quite a bit of money coming through the city of Houston, and then the mainstream resources, like in your community, come through the county. So behavioral health systems in particular.
Thank you.
I'm curious, how much of the funds from these setups come from outside the city and county, from private sources or foundations or whatever?
So I would, without having, I don't know that I anticipated this exact question, but what I can say is, one, we can go back and find that out for you. I think that we have data on all of that. But there's two things that are really important in those setups. One is political will. The political will to push the community towards these kinds of solutions and making tough decisions and trying to keep the politics, frankly, out of an evidence-based approach. And that works across all three of these communities that I have experienced myself. In terms of funding, California has a lot of state funding. So I would, if I had to guess around San Diego without looking at their data, having it right in front of me, I would guess that the bulk of the money comes from the state of California, and the city and the county are next highest, and then the Continuum of Care dollars. Whereas that is not necessarily the case in Spokane. I think in Spokane, probably the bulk of the money is federal money, and then maybe city and state, and then county, city and county, and then state. But we can get that information for you if you'd like. Mm-hmm. Again, I think it's really about understanding your own strengths, what the community brings to the table, and maximizing the impact that you can have, both from a leadership perspective and from a funding perspective. So here's your continuum of care as it stands right now. What I will note, and Josh will hopefully correct me if I'm wrong here, is that there's some new energy around HIAC, and really the restructuring process has already started. Folks are already thinking about how to make your continuum of care more robust and more able really to make well-informed decisions across a number of stakeholders in your community, and to create that strong structure that we've been talking about. So right now, your collaborative applicant, as I've mentioned a couple of times, is the city of Asheville, and you have 16 seats, 8 of which are appointed by the city council, 8 of which are appointed by the county commissioners, and then you have some work groups that have been put together to do specific kinds of projects. And I've heard from Josh and from members of your staff in the community that probably the best functioning work group that you have, and the work that's really, again, going back to sort of shared accountability, shared understanding and decision-making, is really around Code Purple. And then you have a number of key partners here in your community. I won't read off all of these words. Again, they're discussed at some length in the report itself. And for those of you who have access to the PowerPoint deck, you can read it. But you have HIAC, who we've already talked about, starting to go through a process of restructuring, rethinking to how to use their authority and responsibilities. You have, of course, the city of Asheville, who has 4 full-time, am I right with 4? 4 full-time staff people working on this issue in their own division and acting as the collaborative applicant for your continuum of care. You have the county, who again brings to the table these mainstream resources, but doesn't really have enough dedicated staff. I think it's less than 1 full-time equivalent dedicated staff. And that's one of the recommendations that we're making in this report, is to increase the dedicated staff to adding 1 full-time equivalent at this point. You have your housing authority. My understanding is that, the head of your housing authority sits on HIAC and, hi, is that you? And can tie those things together in really robustly structured continuums of care. Housing authorities have a really important role to play and a seat at the table. And then you have the Homeless Coalition. You have a number of homelessness and housing service providers and community stakeholders. And then I'm going to just end this slide with the VA. You're going to see a little bit later that you have a lot of resources for veterans experiencing homelessness in your community. The VA isn't tied strongly enough to the continuum of care in your community, and has a lot of resources that aren't really right now sort of fully coordinated in ways that make a lot of operational sense. So before we take a break, I know I'm running a little bit over, but I just want to one more time note some key takeaways here. Again, we want to make sure you lack an entity that really can do that heavy lift of coordination and collaboration. Your continuum of care has to include, but shouldn't be limited to, your local governments. You have a lot of other stakeholders that care about this in your community and that have expertise to bring to the table. This will also take time. I want to note that because I think it's really important. We're going to have to figure out in your community exactly what the right structure is that makes sense here with your local environment. And that's going to take a little bit of time. We want to act with urgency, but we want to make sure that we're grounded in the values that this community has brought forward. So I think we are scheduled for a break. Want to do 10 minutes and then we'll be back and we'll start talking about the state of housing and homelessness.
I'm not sure if this is working. Is it a little?
All right,
We'll put you.
So we'll reconvene at 2:25.
The button is funny.
You've heard now about what a good system looks like and what structure and governance to get there looks like. So we're going to turn our attention for the rest of this presentation today to the state of housing and homelessness in your own community and what the recommendations actually lay out in terms of a roadmap. And we always start, when we start talking about housing and homelessness in any community, we almost always start with this chart. This chart is the result of some research that was done by the University of Pennsylvania and Zillow. You all know Zillow, they have a research arm. And the reason that we want to talk about this is because you heard me say, and you heard Josh say, that your system is impacted quite a bit, not just by the housing market, but by inflow into the system and how quickly folks can move out of your system. That flow, that roundabout that Josh talked about, how quickly can the cars or the people move through that system so that we are really ensuring that people are experiencing homelessness for the least amount of time possible. And what this chart tells us is that in any community, this is nationwide, and you can go and actually look at your own community in Zillow's data. When in a community, when households broadly pay more than 30% of their income in housing, homelessness increases at a faster rate. And you all are experiencing that here in this community right now. So what you can see here on this chart, this is really about potential inflow and your affordable housing situation. Your region has a high number of rent-burdened households. And here's what we mean when we talk about that. In the chart that's on the left, that's renter households in the city of Asheville and in Buncombe County. And it shows you how many are cost burdened, which means they're paying more than 30% of their income towards rent, or severely cost burdened, which means that they're paying more than half of their income towards rent. So the numbers themselves are not the important message here. This is important because you can see, if you go back to the Zillow chart, your community is actually in a position where the homelessness is increasing at a more rapid pace because you have too many households paying more than 30% of their income towards rent. And the chart on the right here is renter households by income. That is happening because the incomes in your community are quite low. The red circle are households making less than $20,000 a year. So as rents increase and household income doesn't change, the gap is getting wider and wider in your community. And this has an impact on your homelessness assistance system in two ways. As we just saw through the Zillow chart, it actually increases the number of folks who are flowing into your system, but it also creates a lack of flow in your system because folks can't get out. There is not enough affordable housing, even for folks who have assistance. There is not enough affordable housing for them to exit the system. So your system is stuck. That's why we keep going back to that roundabout that Josh talked about. The system is stuck in part because you have your affordability is very high in your community. And if I remember correctly, Asheville is more expensive, the city of Asheville is more expensive than 98% of your state, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. So not only do you have an affordability issue, which means that the rents for the units that are available are unaffordable, they're too high for the incomes that you have in your community, that's creating this lack of flow through your system. You also have a supply challenge here. And what this set of data really shows you is that your vacancy rate, your rental vacancy rate across the county is low. But the vacancy rate for subsidized properties is less than 1%. So for folks who need rental assistance or are eligible for rental assistance in your community because their incomes are so low, it is virtually impossible for them to access those resources. And then you can also note those last two bullets on this slide are really important. Since the start of the pandemic, in March of 2020, rents have risen 41.7%. It's a really short amount of time that to have that level of increase. And as I noted earlier, if you look at the fair market rents across your state, Asheville, the city of Asheville, is more expensive than 98% of North Carolina. So there's a lot of discussion here about housing and why it matters. This is why it matters. And again, this is about spending, and there's a couple of caveats that I want to make before
And if
yes.
this is Kim.
Oh, I'm so
before-
sorry, Kim. I forgot that you had questions. Yeah.
No, it's okay. This is a really important conversation for us to have. Can we go back one slide before we leave the conversation around housing? And I know we're at a joint meeting today, and I know that our colleagues on the county commission are looking at this too, but this tells a picture of what's happening with the people who have the least amount of resources in our community. But I think we all acknowledge that there are specific areas around race and gender that are impacted in this population and our LGBTQ population among our
right.
youth.
That's right. We actually have a chart in a couple of slides that shows the overrepresentation of people of color in the population of people who are experiencing homelessness. In the report itself, we expand on that quite a bit. And also LGBTQ people with disabilities, marginalized populations are overrepresented in folks who are in deep poverty, as well as folks who are experiencing homelessness in your community. And that actually has to be taken into account as well.
So if I might ask my previous question, because it can relate to this, is I realize that we don't have numbers on these slides, but lifting up individuals and groups that are providing interventions to unsheltered homelessness. On page 19, there's a list under interventions in the COC, and not every person that's housing a family member or neighbor is going to be listed in there, and that doesn't
Absolutely.
mean that they're not doing the work. But how did organizations end up on this list, or were they excluded, so that people can understand that this obviously isn't the fullest of the people doing the work to address homelessness in our community?
That's a good question, and I'm going to have to ask Josh to answer it.
No, that's a great question, Kim. So we highlighted those interventions based off of what organizations were highlighted on the housing inventory count that goes to HUD. And then also some of specifically the street outreach to folks who are funded to do that specific homelessness outreach. And I think I added that not everybody in the community who is doing some great work, that might be an advocacy organization or other nonprofits, were highlighted, but those are just the ones who are doing the funded to do that housing specific.
So for folks who are watching this conversation and don't see their work reflected, this document is, and the slide we saw today is representing people who are receiving federal HUD funding effectively.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the clarification. Appreciate it. And in that same vein, I want to provide some caveats before we talk about spending. First is we did quite a bit of work to try and scan what kind of spending is happening through city, county, and federal sources. There are a number of other sources of funding in your community, philanthropic dollars. We talked about the VA funding. There are a number of private organizations, private nonprofit organizations that have their own budgets that are not reflected in this chart. And that doesn't mean that what they're doing, to your point, is not incredibly important. It's actually related to one of the recommendations that we're making in this report, which is to do a full scan. We just didn't have the scope available to us to do a full scan of your community to really understand the budgets of those nonprofit organizations as well, and to get a more full picture.
And would that include our home funds for our Ford County region and our community development block grant funds? 'Cause
Yeah,
I know
those are
folks asking-
included, I believe, in this chart. Yeah. So here's what I want to note on this chart. Again, it's not representative of all the funding that you have in your community. And there are a number of investments here that actually are over. But the top chart is your regular spending. That chart shows your regular allocations of your continuum of care dollars, which we talked about earlier, your home funding, your CDBG dollars that come from community development block grant. I caught myself. Community development block grant dollars that come through from the federal government through your state, city and county. So that's your regular spending. From those resources, as well as city and county dollars. And you can see that number is over $3 million per year. And the bottom chart is meant to show some of the pandemic response resources that have been provided in this community over the last couple of years. And that is a significantly higher amount. And that's important because some of those funding sources are already expired. Some of them have already been used. Some of them are seeds for new permanent supportive housing units that are coming online later this year. If we heard earlier, we have 198, is that right? PSH units coming online later this year. So those funds have largely already been spoken for. And the scale of those funds is quite a bit higher than your regular spending. So the point that we're trying to really bring home to folks in this setting and in our report is that even with the increased dollars that you received a large amount of money, you used it well, but you're still not meeting the need within your community. So it is incredibly important for decision makers and the continuum of care and all the stakeholders at this point. Timing matters as this funding runs out and as new units come online, to make sure that you all have the resources that you need so that there isn't, so that the sort of trajectory of how these resources get expended doesn't create any sort of a cliff for your community.
I do have a question here, and maybe I'm not seeing where it falls into this bucket, but maybe staff could help us understand where the ARP home funds land in this, and if they're not in here, why they're not. Because I think that was emergency funding, right? It's still, we have a consultant process around.
I'm happy to speak to that. Because they're not allocated yet. So they are not represented here, but that's about $4.1 million.
Thank you.
I'll add that is for a 4-county consortium region.
Thank you. That's a great question. But you can see we tried to put the names of the projects next to the funding streams that have already been allocated so that the community can see how those funds have been spent and what resources you're getting from them. And then the last thing I'll note before I turn it over to Josh is that the emergency housing voucher allocation, you received 47 vouchers. Your community is actually exceeding the rate of lease up than as compared to most of the country. So you all have been using those resources as best as you can, and a lot of communities have been struggling with this. Your community is at 98% leasing, and that's a big deal. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Josh.
I do want to just clarify one thing about the interventions. I said yes to your question, but it's either yes that you're getting federal funding, or they've been counting on the housing inventory count, and which I'll share in a little bit about what that actually looks like and what that actually is.
Thank you,
I just want to make that clarification. All right, so I'm going to go through some of these. I think we've highlighted some of the strengths underway that are happening in the community. We kind of started there, but some of the things that I'll share is that more than 72% of the leaders in the homelessness sector, based off our survey, believes that it's solvable, right? Which that is a great first step is to believe that we can do it, and those are the folks who are in charge of making it happen. Some of these other pieces that we've already we've highlighted, there has been some already, as we've been having these conversations with the community, some efforts to begin more coordination and break down some of the silos that have been existing in our in the community. And just to highlight, as Ann was just talking about the EHV vouchers, we talked about homelessness really as a housing crisis, right? A housing affordability crisis and the lack of affordability in the community. But we were able to, with the right intentionality, with the right interventions, we're able to get folks housed in a tight housing market. So even though that is a reality, there are things that we can do to house folks quickly. And that is a direct representation of that. We've seen some increases in the emergency shelter for domestic violence that have not come online yet. We've seen, based off the point in time count, some decreases in veteran homelessness. Again, we'll talk about kind of some of the resources available in the community and maybe why that is. And we've seen some intentionality with utilizing diversion, right? We have to. We'll talk about a coordinated entry system, but we have to look at that. But we have seen some increase of diversion and some actual investment in diversion as one of the things that really stops, which really helps with addressing inflow. There has been a lot of efforts to get more data. That's a continuous thing we need. Because if we don't know what's happening across all parts of the system, we can't make data-driven decisions. And honestly, based off of, you can look around, based off of the first break, there is an energy to actually come up with a solution that I think is palpable and really needs to be capitalized to make some meaningful change. So I just want to give a snapshot of what the homeless system data looks like per the point in time count. The reason we are here, right? There's been a drastic increase in unsheltered homelessness, and defined what unsheltered homelessness meant. We've seen an actual 330% increase from 2010. We see in veteran homelessness, actually, let me go back one time. That's something I really wanted to highlight. And we also see that 1/3 of the folks experiencing homelessness is experiencing unsheltered homelessness, which is also a national trend we're seeing as well. So these are the folks who are experiencing sheltered homelessness. That means they're staying in emergency shelter, transitional housing, or some type of safe haven. And these are the folks who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness, meaning they're sleeping in a place not meant for human habitation. So as you see from this, the takeaway from this slide is that majority of the folks experiencing homelessness in the community are single individuals. We've seen again, the decrease in veteran homelessness. We have seen a slight increase of some veterans experiencing unsheltered homelessness, but majority of the veterans who are accounted for in the homeless system are sheltered, meaning they're in a transitional housing program. We have seen an increase of chronic homelessness, meaning chronic means someone who's experienced homelessness for a year or multiple times over a few years and has a disabling condition. And those when folks are chronic homelessness, when we say permanent supportive housing, that's what permanent supportive housing is. And I kind of jumped over for the definition for time purposes. But permanent supportive housing is for folks who are highest acuity. It's not for everyone experiencing homelessness in the community. That's not the definition of housing first. It's not for everyone to get permanent supportive housing. But for the folks in the highest need in your community who needs that intense intervention, that's what permanent supportive housing for. And it's really geared for folks experiencing chronic homelessness. As Ann teed up, we also know that there is a equity issue in homelessness. This is not a Asheville-Buncombe COC issue. This is a national issue as far as being overrepresentation in the homeless system. We know that in the county, there 6% of the folks are Black. 10% of the folks experiencing poverty are Black, but close to 24% of folks experiencing homelessness are Black. And that's per the 2021 data. HUD has an equity tool that we put in the report that you can look into that a little bit more. And it's something that we really need to make sure we put our attention to, because historically we've utilized colorblind techniques to address homelessness, which unfortunately sometimes created more inequities by doing that colorblind approach. So we really have to be intentional with how we do the work, and that's why we're really intentional about using equity with it as the foundation of the work we do to address the crisis of homelessness. So I talked about a housing inventory count. This is something that we that's submitted to HUD in regards to what interventions we currently have in our community. This is the 2022 housing inventory count. There will be a new one that is going to look probably a lot different than this, but we didn't have access to it. So this is the one we used. So so they're little tiny beds. We were trying to figure out what's the best way to visualize what you all have in the community. But what you can see is there's a lot of veteran resources, right? And that's because of a federal effort to really address veteran homelessness, and we've seen it. We've seen a decrease nationally of veteran homelessness, and there's a lot of veteran resources in the community. What happens is, so there's not the same level of investment for folks who are single adults and non-veterans. So if you look at emergency shelter beds, right here it says 171 annually, that's per the 2022 housing inventory count. But once you take away the 66 temporary beds that are no longer available, there's 105 available beds, year-round beds for folks experiencing homelessness who are single adult and who are non-veteran. Again, I'm just gonna go back really quick. We have 232 people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. Also, I told you, one of the most important interventions for addressing homelessness, again, using that housing first model, which understands that the only way, in the most evidence-based way to address homelessness is by giving folks housing. And that housing is going to look different for every single person, and the supports that are offered and the amount of interventions that are offered are going to look different for every person. But that is how you address homelessness, right? So rapid rehousing, if you think back to that roundabout, is the way to get folks out of that crisis of homelessness, which leads to so much trauma for those individuals. But we have 41 rapid rehousing, which is roughly around 2 to 3 referrals a month for folks experiencing homelessness in the community.
Josh, before we move on from this, I know this came up in the council check-in I was in, but I want to make sure it's getting across to the public that's helping us navigate this tricky situation. At the top, it says 171 year-round beds, but we talked about how those are not all available today.
Yes.
So when we're looking at those blue squares, there's only 105 of them?
No, so we wanted to be true to the housing inventory count. We didn't want to get into manipulating the numbers. We want to say this is what the housing inventory of 2022 says. We want to use this. We use this side over here to clarify if there's any discrepancies, right? Like, we know that this says 171, but we know that those beds were maybe they're not available. They're not actually available beds. So we can't say.
And that was specifically related to COVID relief funding emergency shelter that are no longer online anymore, just to clarify.
Well, no. I would say that. So there's 30 of these beds were funded by Emergency Solution Grant, CV or COVID funds that are still available.
I'm saying at that time, I think we had the Ramada Inn open.
Yes.
Which we don't anymore.
Yes.
And that was 114 or some
It was counted.
fairly large number, I think, was captured here that no longer exists, is my only point.
The snapshot is not an accurate picture of what's happening
Right,
today.
it's not the current status.
Right, and the reason I bring this up is as our community is going to help us navigate this crisis, the very executive summary of your report notes that there are not enough shelter or permanent housing beds to meet the need. And I think that's something we're constantly struggling with in our community is because we're only looking at a snapshot, I know there's going to be a recommendation for maybe looking at more point in time counts, for example. But I just want to make sure that folks know that this snapshot is not a picture of today.
Yep. And there will be.
Can I add 2 quick things? Those 66 beds are from the Ramada, the 66 that are identified in parentheses there. And also the housing inventory count is submitted along with the point in time count. So this is year-old data. This is from January of last year.
Thank you.
Yep. And that's why we wanted to try to pull out and make the, the available, what's actually available today as far as what goes year round. But again, there will be an updated housing inventory count that will give an accurate statement. But also, as we improve data, we can get from all parties in the community. And as far as sharing data, we can get these numbers in real time and really have more accurate assessments. So just really quick, just key takeaways from this. We talked about BIPOC folks are disproportionately impacted by homelessness, specifically Black folks. Resources for non-veterans kind of lag behind resources for veteran. The community sheltered and rapid rehousing interventions in the community are inadequate based off of the need. And there's going to be, as Ann mentioned, some programs that were funded through the COVID, the pandemic funds that are no longer going to be available in the community, i.e. those 41 beds, once those funds run out. 41 rapid rehousing slots. So I just want to talk briefly, because we want to really get to some of the recommendations, some of the meat of the stuff. I just want to talk about our process and who we talk to. We talked to over 250 folks with recent lived experience. We made a really intentional investment in trying to hear from folks who are most impacted by homelessness in the community. We talked to over 1,700 folks, either via survey or via focus groups, around what's happening. A good chunk of those folks were property owners and the business community. These are some of the providers we talked to, again, doing great work in the community, even if maybe some of them didn't end up on the intervention one we showed. And then here is what we heard. So this is the overwhelming trends and the themes of the survey. There's a lack of trust in the system. There's a lack of a belief in the current homeless strategy. I think partly because I don't think there is an understanding of what that current strategy is, who's leading it, how are decisions being made, and where is my voice in this conversation. There's public safety concerns, right? And I think when we hear public safety concerns, we think about, sometimes folks who are community in the community who have a home, but the public safety concerns came from folks experiencing homelessness as well. There was a eagerness to feel safe in the community, even if I don't have a place to live. There's also addressing the high barrier. There's a high barrier shelter or lack of limited access to shelter as a community barrier. Our difficulty eligibility criteria to access some services. Not sure, because there's not a theme that goes throughout the system, each program can have a different criteria how to enter the system. So if I go to one program to enter, I might need to do all the list of different rules in order to access versus if I go to another one, right? So if you're experiencing homelessness, you're in crisis, that can be confusing, right? And also for folks who are trying to advocate for folks experiencing homelessness, that can be confusing. There's a need for more behavioral health, ongoing behavioral health services. One of the things that we talked about is, we heard loud and clear from providers and folks experiencing homelessness, is that if someone's in a crisis, there is enough resources to go to. The issue happens when they get discharged, and either they have to make an appointment a week from now, and there's not a lot of coordination between providers and folks who are providing that ongoing services, and there's just not a lot of options. That's what we heard. We already talked about the affordable housing and uncoordinated care, which is kind of been a theme, and then the need for some employment programs. All right, so I'm going to spend just a little bit of time here, and we're going to move forward to our recommendations. So what we heard from the community was what I shared on the last screen, and we created, based off of the input we got, some values that we believe should be at the center of decisions moving forward. And these are the things you see before you. I want to walk. I should have put the Chappelle on. Lapel. Can you all hear me?
Well,
Yeah.
Back there. All right. So first one is to be bold, right? And we have to be aggressive. We have to be able to try. We have to be able to learn. We have to be able to
now you can walk if you. You got it. Yep.
I got to figure this out later. Hold on. We can't be scared to make tough decisions. right? We have to be driven by what works, what the evidence say, what the data says. We have to be bold in our decisions. We have to create accountable and transparent governance structures, right? We don't want to hide anything. How decisions are made should be well known to everyone. Everyone's voice who is a part of the COC or a member of the COC should be accounted for, right? We have to build trust through unity, collaboration, and justice. We have to have meaningful communication and collaboration, not only amongst the leadership, but amongst all aspects of the system. We have to focus on housing solutions. We have to value voices of people with lived experience. We have to ensure that the tables where decisions are being made look like the folks who are experiencing homelessness in the community. We have to maintain fidelity to the data and the evidence. Our data tells a story.
So true.
Allow for it to tell us that story and to drive the decisions. Politics will not drive policies. So in order to be bold, we have to use what we know works. And we have to focus on the future. I know, honestly, through a lot of our conversations, there's been some historical issues of mistrust, and this person doing this, and this program not getting along with this program, but we have to move forward. There's people who are literally counting us to work together and to collaborate to address their homelessness, and we can't allow for whatever history of issues to impact our future decisions. So just some key takeaways. The community is motivated. You guys are there. We know that services and housing are hard to access, not coordinated, and insufficient. Everything we're saying, and specifically the community values and what we heard, and also our recommendations, were directly shaped by what we heard from the folks in the community, but what we know works and has worked in other communities. So we're going to make the shift over to recommendations, and I'm going to pass it to Ann.
Walking thing. You can tell Josh is a little taller than I am. Y'all are okay to keep going, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
just want to check in case folks need a break. So you might be, I think you can now see where we're going, right? We started up here with a really broad view. What does a system look like? What does governance look like? What are the numbers in your community? What are the values that, for the first time in this presentation today, we got applause, and it was because of the community values that Josh just walked through. That tells me that your community is invested in those values. We didn't make those values up. We heard them from you all. So we had the data, what we heard from your community, what your community values in terms of an approach. And now we're getting to the nitty-gritty of it, of the recommendations. And all of that was necessary, right? We actually have to set the context. Ending homelessness is not a simple solution in this country. And you needed all of that information to really understand the recommendations that we're going to walk through now. So the first thing I want to identify as we start walking through recommendations is something that Josh talked about earlier and that we got a couple of questions on, which is really about what are the gaps in your system. And here are two of the gaps that we see in your system, really just looking at these numbers and your data on its face. We see gaps in both emergency shelter and rapid rehousing. You can see that there is a difference between the current inventory, or the inventory as reflected in your 2022 data that we adjusted for what we know is offline. So the difference between the number of people who are experiencing homelessness at a point in time and the resources that are available to them, there's a gap, there's a difference there. And you can see that gap that we've identified is 127 beds for shelter and 596 interventions for rapid rehousing. So I think it's important here to understand that very simple math tells us that we need additional resources in these two categories, including 60 beds for adults experiencing homelessness, emergency shelter beds for non-veteran adults experiencing homelessness, and then an additional 25 what we are calling enhanced emergency shelter beds for people who are experiencing homelessness. And what we mean by enhanced is that they have access to behavioral health resources that are attached to those emergency shelter beds for folks who want and need them in your community. And then there was also a much smaller gap for families experiencing homelessness in your community. So we're recommending filling that gap with 10 additional emergency shelter beds for families. And then for rapid rehousing, we see that there are gaps there. We're not suggesting that you fill the gap with a one-to-one. I think that that's a really important thing for folks to understand, because there's actually two ways to fill a gap. You can do a one-to-one, but frankly, that means that you're not using your resources very, very efficiently. You can fill a gap also by increasing flow through the system, so any one of these beds or interventions is turning over multiple times over the course of a year, right? So, and how you do that is you have rapid rehousing. So we're recommending 200 slots of rapid rehousing for individuals per year and additional 50 slots for families per year. And we think that with an investment in resources and strengthened governance, and you'll see a number of the recommendations in more detail in just a moment, that you can actually set the goal and meet the goal of decreasing and reducing unsheltered homelessness by half in 2 years. And so I believe that when we say that, what we mean is we're using the 2022 point in time count as the base, but 2 years from now is the 2025 point in time count. So measuring against the 2022 count, which is what we have right now, but by the time the 2025 point in time count is done in January of 2025, we would have at least half of the unsheltered homelessness in your community reduced. There's a reason that we called this report Within Reach. In order to reach that goal or really drive towards that North Star that we just articulated, we have identified 5 broad strategies that this community should pursue. These sets of strategies have a lot of, you've seen the report. There's pages and pages of priorities and action steps that we tried to identify as short, medium, and long-term. Because you always have to be looking out. You all clapped when Josh said, look to the future. You always have to be looking out a couple of years and building towards what you think you need in a couple of years, but have short-term strategies that have a lot of impact right now on the people that are suffering in your community. And those strategies include creating that strong foundation. It's why we spent a lot of time today talking about collaboration, talking about governance and what a structure would look like, what systems level planning and data looks like, and what shared accountability looks like. When you have those things in place, you have a strong foundation so that, to go back to the example that I used in Houston, you can use that foundation when something changes in your community. When we have a recession, when we have a pandemic. The communities that did the best over the course of the pandemic and were able to shift priorities and move quickly were the ones that had that strong foundation of governance and had a culture of collaboration and shared accountability. Second strategy is around implementing evidence-based and inclusive policy. This means that there's a lot of activity around creating that equitable system that Josh talked about, making sure that your resources are person-centered, trauma-informed, that they are meeting the needs of people who are experiencing homelessness in your community. You want to improve, for number 3, in terms of broad strategies, you want to improve your system performance. Everybody can always do better. And you want to make sure that your program design is reflective of what your data tells you. So you want to, there are a number of priorities and action steps related to decreasing inflow. We've heard a lot about that today. We specifically talked about it when we talked about housing and affordable housing in your community, and increasing outflow, which means that folks are getting placed into the services, behavioral health services and other services, job services that they need. They're getting employment. They're able to afford their units, whether it's through supportive housing or regular affordable housing. At the very top of this conversation today, we talked a lot about data. I talked a little bit about homeless management information systems, and then we've talked about data a number of times. You want to be sure that we're using the data to the best of our ability and that we have high quality data that we know is accurate and that we are being accountable to each other and transparent to both people who are experiencing homelessness in this community and to the community more broadly. So increasing coverage for your HMIS is going to be key because right now not everybody participates in your system and there are significant gaps in the data that you have available to you. And then reporting on and looking at and using your system performance data to continually quality control what your system looks like. And I gave you that example earlier of a project that thinks they're doing great, but then when you look at that data in a different way at the system level, it tells you a slightly different story. And then investing in the future, increasing the production of and access to permanent housing solutions within your community. So our report lays out the priority areas and action steps underneath these 5 broad strategies. And for the purposes of today's discussion, we're not going to go through every single priority and action step in that report. It would take us like 2 days to do that. So what we've pulled out here are what the Alliance team thinks are the most important short-term priorities that this community can undertake soon to have the biggest impact and really lean in towards that goal of, or that North Star of reducing unsheltered homelessness by half in 2 years. We have talked about this a lot. The first step really is about, the first priority is about improving your system governance. We're spending the day together tomorrow to talk about that. And to really make some concrete plans towards what a system governance structure should and could look like here in your continuum of care. This also requires the hiring of dedicated staff at the county. We mentioned earlier that the city has 4 dedicated staff for this homelessness work, and the key recommendation here for the county is to also have at least 1 full-time equivalent staff working on this in the county so that there is a staff-to-staff ability to do collaboration and coordination. And this second bullet underneath here, the governance board should not be situated under the city and county. What we mean by that is that right now you saw that the city identifies 8 seats and the county names 8 seats within your continuum of care board. But there's a lot of other stakeholders that should be involved in these discussions. It doesn't mean that the city or the county are necessarily losing any sort of authority. They could still have a couple of seats on the board, but the board needs to be more inclusive of the people who are experiencing homelessness in your community and other stakeholders that can bring something to the table to help solve this problem here. The second key priority we wanted to focus on was developing and implementing an encampment resolution policy. Right now, that is done primarily, it's not done through a specific set of policies, except for with the police. And encampment resolution, in the places that are doing encampment resolution policies, there are usually multidisciplinary teams that don't include the police unless there's actually some criminal activity that's happening. And those multidisciplinary teams are professional outreach workers that can provide trauma-informed care to people who are living in unsheltered situations, and they have access to housing or shelter resources and services that people want and need. So developing and implementing an encampment resolution policy is something that we think is incredibly important for this community to work on quickly.
And to clarify as we move through these key priorities, my understanding based on our previous conversation is the idea would be to have the reconstituted COC, and that COC would be making recommendations around an encampment policy and the other items we're about to talk about.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
So, in order to get to priorities 2 through the end of this, I think there's 8, you actually have to do number 1. Number 1 is to create the governance structure, strengthen your continuum of care, really have the right players at the table in your continuum of care that are making the recommendations and doing the work of developing the necessary operational systems for the rest of these key priorities. So, encampment resolution policy. In order to have a really strong encampment resolution policy that's implementable, you need to build the capacity of your street outreach teams. And I already talked a little bit about what a multidisciplinary approach could look like. And then we also include here having a hotline or a website. One of the things that I think Josh touched on is that your community, the citizens who live in your community don't know what to do when they see somebody experiencing homelessness or in a crisis. There's no website for them to necessarily go to or a place for them to call to get help for somebody. And so what we're suggesting here is having outreach teams that can do that kind of intervention, but also having a centralized way for the public to access these resources. We have one in the District of Columbia where I live. I use it all the time. I actually used to take the phone calls back earlier in my career. I used to take the phone calls on the hotline. But I use it all the time when I see somebody in trouble, and that I know that I can call and they will send an outreach team out to do an intervention.
If I could jump in for 1 sec, one of the, I think, important developments in our community that's been happening in real time is with the expansion of the community paramedic program's launch of their new outreach program. There is now a dedicated number that can be called in just those situations. I don't want to misstate that number, so maybe someone who has it accurately can make sure it gets shared out. But that's come online in the last month or so. So sort of,
I didn't even know.
well, yeah,
Good job.
so just wanting to make sure that folks are aware that that resource is out there, and that team, just to sing their praises for a second, and the many other folks doing outreach work, but that team is able to do things like mobile wound care, mobile crisis psychiatric and behavioral health care, and referrals to cold purple shelters and other services, and working directly, of course, with many of the frontline providers in the community. So just want to name that as sort of one intervention that was been in the works for a while, but has now been launched and is being built out by an incredible team of folks in the community.
Thank you for that.
And I will ask someone at some point to share the number when whoever can do that accurately, because I can't.
Fantastic. And then, moving through this list, we already talked quite a bit about increasing your crisis response or emergency shelter capacity. We think you need to do that in order to increase flow through your system. And we're recommending that we want to make sure that you can meet 30% of the immediate need for shelter for the people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness in your community. We talked a little bit earlier about access points and coordinated entry. Coordinated entry was envisioned really, and in communities where coordinated entry works the best, really envisioned as a way that people who are experiencing homelessness or housing instability access resources in your system. It's a triage approach to ensuring that there is a standardized way that folks are assessed, and there's a way to move them into the intervention that makes the most sense for them, or that will create the safety they need for their immediate purposes. So your coordinated entry system could certainly be more robust, and our recommendation, again, this is a building block of your system, to begin the implementation of improvements to your coordinated entry system quickly in the short term. And then number 5 and number 6 here are two sort of projects that your community could take on that we have seen other communities use to create some really positive momentum, get some movement through your system, and to really show the public that progress can be made. So the first is to create what we call a high utilizer initiative. And that means developing and implementing sort of a housing-focused pilot for rehousing, let's say up to 20 folks who utilize a lot of resources within your system. I did this myself when I worked in the District of Columbia. We got folks together, we identified 20 or 30 people in our system that were cycling through jails, that were cycling through emergency rooms, that were high utilizers of shelter, so they were staying in shelter for very long periods of time. All of that costs money. Folks who are using the ambulance system quite a bit. All of those things cost your system money, not the homeless system, but cost your taxpayers money. So to target 20 or 30 high utilizers and really create a path for them to be rehoused and rehoused as quickly as possible can create some positive momentum within your community. So that's one of our short-term recommendations. And then promoting a housing surge. And what we've seen, again, in other communities that has really built some positive momentum and created the muscle that you need to do true collaboration within your community is to do something like a 100-day challenge. And here's how it can work. The COC board gets together and says, in 100 days, we want to house 100 people. You've probably heard, if you are in our work, you've heard other communities do this. So our goal is to work together, figure out where we can streamline our processes, figure out how we want to use our resources so that we get 100 people housed in 100 days. And then the community works towards that. It helps you create, again, sort of that positive momentum. It helps people who really are in need get into housing and the services that they want and need. It also, again, helps you build that muscle of coordination and collaboration and use your new governance structure to the best of, to its maximum extent. And then this last one, number 7, is really about taking a look at your current system. In your supportive housing units that are already online, there are probably people in those units that don't actually need the really intensive intervention that it was created to provide. Really what they need now is affordable housing with some light supports. So who can you work with to move into a regular affordable housing unit or swap out their subsidy? How can you be creative in this and make sure that they have the support that they need in terms of mainstream services, but you're freeing up a spot for somebody else who actually needs the intensive supportive services that comes along with those supportive housing units. So those are the key priorities that the report recommends this community move forward on fairly quickly. And Before we end our discussion today, we just want to take a moment to talk a little bit about costs, considerations and projections around costs. What I've noted a couple of times now that some of your data has gaps in it. So these are projections. They are not going to be super specific costs unless otherwise noted, because there's a little bit of work that has to be done here. And one of our recommendations, as I mentioned earlier, was to really get a handle on what resources are in this community in terms of funding. But we can see that adding a staff person, which is the very first line on this chart, in Buncombe County, having a full-time equivalent has a specific cost related to it. It's about $100,000 to $125,000 for the county. And then, creating the subcommittees and work groups that you're going to need in order to move forward. There are some costs related to that, paying people for their time where it's needed, especially people with lived expertise, making sure they're compensated for their expertise, making sure you have meeting space or Zoom space, all of those things. We estimate that at somewhere around $24,000 per year. We also know that you need to improve your homeless management information system and increase coverage. We think you have to increase coverage by 4 organizations. It's not a huge lift, but there is a cost related to that. So estimating about $968 per user. If you have 5 people in each of those 4 organizations using the HMIS on a regular basis, there's that cost related to that. And then increasing your shelter and temporary housing capacity. We, again, are recommending 60 shelter beds for single adults, non-veterans, 25 enhanced shelter beds, and 10 beds for families. This is a place where there's some gaps in terms of how much this might cost, but we know based on a report that was done by a set of consultants, I believe last year, that for non-congregate facilities, it costs about $25,000 per bed, but you could do this in other ways to get them up and running more quickly and at a lower cost if it's a congregate shelter. We're also, again, recommending, based on those gaps that we saw, that there is an increase in rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing overall, but this focuses in on rapid rehousing. 200 rapid rehousing slots for single adults, non-veterans, and 50 rapid rehousing slots for families with children at the cost per unit. So $11,000 per adult, and I don't know what that says.
I guess I'm trying to understand what that number means, because I can tell you the city and the county and Dogwood have funded 200 units of permanent supportive housing, and we're talking about millions of dollars. So
Yep.
what is that? Is that an annual operation cost, assuming you already have the housing unit?
Yeah, so rapid
Okay,
rehousing is not a hard cost. So the millions for permanent supportive
Capital.
housing is the hard cost. This is really intervention for a specific family and using a tenant-based model. So you would use units in the community.
Yeah, and so I guess I'm a little bit concerned about, one of our big barriers is just the housing itself, the actual unit itself.
Yep.
Coming online. So, before we could conduct a surge or something like that, I mean, the major challenge would be to identify available units or the need to construct additional units.
Yeah.
I think we're kind of acknowledging that. That's an assumption.
I think that's right. And those acknowledgements are certainly detailed in the report itself. What I can say is that when you're doing a surge like this, my own experience is that when you do a surge or you're increasing, units that are available for a specific sort of community benefit, one of the things that really has to go along with that is a set of landlord engagement strategies. Clearly, somebody has been doing that if you're at 98% or 96% utilization of your emergency housing vouchers. So, and other communities aren't. So I think that there are some strategies that you could use to engage landlords in a way that might be helpful to get to these numbers.
Yeah, and we do have a couple of organizations that are really focusing on that effort.
Fantastic. Josh?
And I was just gonna add that a part of rapid rehousing is that landlord engagement piece. It is that paying for rent, that's where that cost comes from. That also is that wraparound case management that provides that housing security. But in the report, we didn't go into detail here, including some of the specific landlord engagement strategies, but there's other models such as shared housing, there's master leasing that communities with tight housing markets have been found success with using as an approach. But you need to have a provider to do it. So even if we don't have rapid rehousing, then we're asking maybe a case manager at a shelter to do like landlord engagement outside of the shelter, or somebody, maybe street outreach, to do some of that stuff. So rapid rehousing is that key component to do that really in the dirt, in the weeds, landlord engagement, to really find those landlords, because we know we can't just say, go out and find a landlord in Asheville. So I think that's where that rapid rehousing piece is crucial.
And that cost is inclusive of that work. Is that right, Josh? Yes. That was a great question. Thank you, Madam Mayor. And then we also talked about enhancing your street outreach. In order to create a multidisciplinary team from scratch, that usually costs about $600,000, and that's not what we're recommending here. What we're recommending is to rework some of the resources that you already have in place to ensure that your outreach teams do have that multidisciplinary approach to them, and that there's some additional staffing added to those teams so that that coordination can be done in real time.
I have a question about HMIS.
Yes.
So I know we may get into the weeds a little bit tomorrow at the HIAC meeting and retreat, but are you noticing some general areas of weakness? I know there's some specific concerns around protections for our neighbors experiencing intimate partner violence. So what are maybe some tools that we might be able to look at in general to make sure that we have accurate data while still providing protections for our most vulnerable people?
That's right. So I'll just say the part that I know, which is that your system coverage is really not high enough to be able to extrapolate the data that you need, or to make really accurate decisions about what's happening in your system. It was hard for us to understand the flow because there's a couple of large providers that don't participate in HMIS. So the first priority is to ensure that your coverage is high enough that you can really use the data that you have. Go ahead, Josh.
So I think just generally, there's gaps in unsheltered homelessness. There has been some efforts that have been put in place, but they're still working on getting that data to ensure that it's clean and accurate. That's just some ongoing TA which is going to be tremendous with the hiring of the city for a HMIS actual person who's going to be dedicated to that. Then there's just getting we don't have I think we have HMIS access for 30 shelter beds in the community. So that's a gap. We have for folks fleeing domestic violence. There is a comparable database that they use. They're actually not allowed to use the HMIS system, but they use a comparable database that they're able to work within the system and get numbers as needed. That doesn't provide any personal identifying information. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
So that was a lot of information. It feels like I've been standing up here for a long time, but it's actually a lot of information in a fairly short period of time. And we're going to end this section with some, again, key takeaways that are reflected in the report. And the first is reducing unsheltered homelessness by half in 2 years by implementing these recommendations is doable and can be your North Star that helps guide the foundational work as well as the work that needs to happen across your provider community. Again, most of these recommendations involve the city and the county governments, but really what we're expecting is that that step one, that key priority one, creating a stronger governance structure, happens first, or at least alongside a number of these other activities, and that these activities are funneled through that new structure. So all of this is really the foundation for what can be action plans. In most other communities that I have worked in, and certainly in the federal government, when I was implementing our federal strategic plan, we took these strategies and priorities and action steps and actually created a work plan for ourselves that shows who's responsible for what deadlines you're trying to meet, and really shows how things are interconnected. Because as you can see, over the last several hours, everything is interconnected in all of this. You can't really just decide to do one piece and not do a bunch of the other pieces because things are so connected together.
Thank you. Could we go back a few slides to those 7 recommendations?
There should be 8, but I think there's 2 5s.
Oh, my bad. There's 8, excuse me.
Oh, I thought I was losing my mind there. I was like,
Okay.
what? I know there's 8.
So one thing that I know time is short today, but I'd like to just flag for a bit of conversation, and then as we move forward with any action plans, thinking about, and I think you just alluded to this, is that items 4, 5, and 6, I think, are ones that we both have real-time, really impactful work happening on right now that are responding to very acute, critical needs in the community. And that I would love to see us figure out some action plans that involve sort of short-term triaged action around, parallel to, consistent with the sort of structural governance level work, but we and I think everyone in this room carries in one way or another in their heart the story of someone who's out there right now who needs this help yesterday. And many folks in the room are also working around issues of addiction and the very alarming increasing rates of overdose deaths that we're seeing. And we know there's a high degree of overlap among folks who are unhoused and folks who are living with addiction and at great risk for overdose death because of the lethality of drugs that are out on the street right now. So I guess I just really want to sort of plant a flag on the side of us as a community figuring out how we do a both and of really embracing the building that longer term runway and the structural work that will support this over the longer term and ultimately have the kind of transformative effects you're describing, while also really being able to be in that triage approach that, I mean, I think our community was really able to do during the COVID pandemic, and day in and day out, many people working on the front lines of this issue are doing that. But we need, I think, to name that as part of the work that's immediately in front of us. So would love to hear thoughts you have about how communities can do a bit of that both and.
And you're talking specifically, I think on the next slide, the concept around a surge.
I'm sorry, it was 4, 6, and 4,
Well-
5B, and 6. Yeah, so it was 4,
Right.
yeah, it was the crisis-based work around helping folks get shelter and access to the services.
And the high
utilizer targeted initiative, which I think overlaps with item 4.
That's right.
And then 6, which overlaps with both of those also.
So in other words, can we advance these triage type of actions before we have in place a new governance structure?
I think.
Is that what is that?
Yeah, that's the question. I also have the phone number for the outreach program. Can I just say it real quick while I have the mic? Okay. This is the Community Paramedic Outreach Program, which anyone in the community can call if they see someone who needs help, and a multidisciplinary team will respond. And the number is 828-575-6652, 828-575-6652. Thank you.
Thanks. What I will note is that I think that this is actually already happening in your community around Code Purple, right? Like the best example of how to do things in parallel rather than in sequence, right, is how you all have operated and implemented Code Purple this year, which was an increase in resources and a change in the way that the community collaborates. That's as much as I can say about it, so I would ask you all to maybe expand on that if there's more to say there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the primary recommendation is that HIAC, or the COC governance structure, should be the planning body for these decisions. That can happen, and with that, and we'll talk about it tomorrow in more detail, which again, HIAC has represented some great community stakeholders, but really working to create a clearly defined structure as we demonstrated in those other communities early on. With that being said, we have a COC governance structure already right now. We're gonna work to improve and kind of get clear decision-making power. But I would say we can work on those goals and work on improving the COC but still using the COC as the decision-making body. I think what we're trying to do is we need to know who's doing what. And the COC board should be the decision-making body to make these initiatives happen because they're representative of all community stakeholders and providers and, folks who have, all different levels of expertise to really make a well-rounded decision. And also, so it can get out of, well, this is the city that made this decision or the county made this decision. It's the COC system that made this decision. And I think those two things can happen at once. So we're not saying that the COC has to be the perfect diagram of blue boxes in order to make these decisions, but we can still work towards that and still make some of these pressing decisions simultaneously.
Yeah, I think that there's always a balance that any community has to strike, especially when they're redoing their governance, between urgency and those other structural things that have to happen. And you all are going to have to find that balance. But I think your point is well taken, that there has to be the urgency piece to it too. And we are not talking about sequential. We are talking about parallel. Any other questions? I'm only taking questions from the table. If we open, I don't think we have the capacity to open it to the audience.
I have one question. In terms of, the future of the governance of the coordinating care, are there specific recommendations about like perspectives or like organizational perspectives or areas of expertise that need to be there that are not currently there? When I look at, and thank you to everyone who serves on it, really appreciate it. But in a lot of ways, it seems like, there's been a lot of good thought put into the folks who do serve on it now. You look at who's there, it's people who work with the leading organizations with homelessness, it's, legal advocacy, it's the medical community, it's the city and the county staff, housing authority. I mean, it's a lot of the kind of folks that you think, well, those folks should definitely be there. So what are the specific gaps that you identified?
So we don't actually make specific recommendations as you're suggesting in the report. What we are suggesting, though, is that because the city and the county are the only two entities that name members of that 16-person board, it doesn't really create a situation where there is shared accountability because it's still seen that only the city and the county are putting people on the board, right? So
do you have other COCs that you're seeing that are self-appointing?
So usually in a COC governance charter, it actually lays out all the different types of folks who appoint seats or have seats on the board. So for example, let's see, I did one in King County. 3 of the seats were their board was much bigger than 16 seats, so I'll just give you a couple of examples. 3 of the seats were appointed by their Lived Experience Coalition. So people experiencing homelessness identified 3 people who were on that. 2 were identified by the mayor, 2 were identified by the county executive. A university partner, the University of Washington, had 1 seat on there. They decided who got their seat. So you can see, and then there were, I think, 4 service provider seats. And service providers decided amongst themselves who took those seats and how it rotated. So there's a number of ways to approach that work, but I think that what we're trying to get to is that shared accountability structure that you don't have right now, because only the city and the county have the authority to put somebody on the Continuum of Care board.
As a follow-up to that, this is a place I'm really particularly curious about the governance, because I think ultimately the governance is the setup of how the power flows in the system for key decision-making, and we want to get that right. And I think there has been a lot of great work done already. And a lot of the language in the report talks about the board should not be situated under the city and the county. And one of the examples I'm hearing you talking about of that right now is who's appointed. Are there other elements of that you could extrapolate, other details beyond the appointment structure that mean out from under the city or the county?
Do you want to take that, Josh?
Honestly, no, that's the primary, what we mean when we say taking it from outside of the city and the county
Okay.
to ensure that, one, that it is governed, truly governed by the COC. I think there's a little bit of cloudiness of where decisions get made. Early on in our conversations with the community, we said, well, how are these recommendations going to move forward? And there was a pause, right? There wasn't a clear, it was this conversation with the city council and the county commissioners. Was that where this ultimately lies? And it's unclear. And so the question about other COCs, we've honestly never seen another COC that was situated like this. That appoints only from the city and the county. At least let me say, and has seen a little bit more. I have never seen another COC like this. So it's not the usual way COCs are structured. And based off of like kind of those examples, either the community stakeholders, right? Like there's like some type of COC membership, which we need to get to as well. But we'll talk more about that tomorrow. And where they vote folks who are on the board to actually govern the system, or there are like some appointed seats based off of where they're at, like hospital or behavioral health. So there always will be representation from diverse stakeholders in the community. So those are some of the things that the COC governance right now will need to work through and think through what that looks like moving forward, because they all ultimately have the power to reclassify kind of what the governance structure looks like. And we'll talk more about what that looks like. In HUD, as Ann mentioned earlier, they don't put everything as far as you need to do X, Y, Z, because they want to create flexibility for the community. They want to make sure what makes sense for Asheville-Buncombe COC is for Asheville-Buncombe COC. So there is that flexibility to make it work for what you think makes the most sense. But we just need to have a clear decision-making body.
I have one more follow-up on that. That makes sense. I understand. Thanks for giving that detail. I think, if we're talking about decision-making power, authority, all that, it also makes me curious about just like the funding and resource flow, right? So if we say, I'm in charge, but I have no resources, is that still the amount of ownership, leadership that is necessary? So could you talk a little bit about, in some of these models, the relationship between folks who traditionally provide funding, i.e. cities and counties and foundations and community partners, and the funding flow to the COCs? Is there, just any examples around that would be helpful.
Sure. So by regulation and by statute, the Continuum of Care, HIAC in this case, actually is the controller of the COC funding, which in your community is just shy of $1.9 million.
Got it.
So they have the authority from HUD to make decisions about that $1.9 million. Then usually in these situations, then the city or the county or the state, depending on how it's set up, also still maintain the authority that their budgetary and fiduciary authority that they have, but the coordination around the use of those federal resources alongside state and local resources or philanthropic resources has a place to sit. And that place is the Continuum of Care Board, so that things are really done in true collaboration. And when decisions are made, they are carried out through all of the different parties. So, how that could look is, we are short X number of supportive housing units. County, you're going to provide the services that go with those units. City, you're going to provide some of your CDBG or home dollars in order to construct those units. The Continuum of Care is going to support, the coordinated entry or services or HMIS that go along with those units. So it's really the place where those decisions sit and how they're carried out. It doesn't take away anybody's fiduciary responsibility, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you. I do have a curiosity around that. As we look at expanding that shared accountability and hopefully shared success with our community in a different way, have you seen some models where we should watch out for making sure we have a certain percentage of people with lived experience at the table? Like what is something to watch out for so that folks aren't overwhelmed by the amount of others at the table? It makes it hard to make recommendations or get work done.
Yeah, we certainly can provide some insights around how to make sure that, and I know that when I was a deputy assistant secretary, I was always staffed. I would imagine most of you are staffed to take part in these kinds of discussions. So I think that the idea of making sure that people with lived expertise have the knowledge and the support that they need to help make the good decisions that need to be made in this community. There's sort of a process and a school of thought behind that would be happy to share. And
We are not staffed, actually, just.
You're not?
No, we're not,
Sorry.
no. I mean, that's why I think with the sweating that's happening here is like just thinking about the staffing and support. That's always our challenge around any structure. I think probably that may be one reason why the COC is currently housed with the city. I mean, because if we were to, I think it would be really interesting to explore a model where they break free, they're their own entity, but I'm having a hard time understanding how that structure gets support to be able to carry out all of its work.
Sure, and I think that you actually have to separate a little bit the function of the collaborative applicant, which is what the city does right now, and what they are funded by HUD to do, and what those responsibilities are, and where the decision-making for your system sits. So in a lot of communities, those two things are tied together because the collaborative applicant does have some funding to support the COC board, make sure meetings happen, make sure minutes are posted, make sure the website is up, all of those things. But I would encourage that you think about those two things somewhat separate, and then we figure out how the collaborative applicant can actually support the COC board overall, that decision-making and collaborative structure.
Can I ask you to describe the collaborative applicant role a bit, just for clarification?
Sure. So the collaborative applicant really is, in HUD's eyes, the organization or entity that submits the funding application to HUD every year. And a funding application to HUD is not a simple document. It's not, a two-page document. It usually includes submitting the plan, submitting your performance metrics, submitting all of the point-in-time data. That happens through that collaborative applicant. It's really the administrative entity that carries out the submission function. That's how HUD envisions the collaborative applicant itself. It is appointed and decided on by the board, by the Continuum of Care board. The Continuum of Care in HUD's regulations actually holds the authority.
I have a question about our guiding light, or North Star as it's named here, is to reduce unsheltered homelessness by 50% in 2 years. And the recommendations you've provided, it would be perhaps easy to get community support to do something like the surge. That sounds exciting, and we're going to work together and we're going to do one of the recommendations. Have you seen any things that we should watch out for, or cautionary tales if we don't follow the recommendations?
I'm not sure how to answer that question.
If it's too hard, if we can't find the way to have an outside of the city and the county collaborative governance structure so it just never happens, like, are we going to meet our goal?
I mean, if I'm being completely honest, it would be really hard to meet the goal if you don't have the structure in place to do that collaboration, if you're not working together in a different way than you currently are. What I would say is that there's a lot of steps here, and it's the reason that why we pulled out 8 key priorities that we think can really help move the needle and create some momentum. And I don't have a crystal ball to tell you what happens if you decide to do nothing. But I think that, I don't hear from your community that that's really an option. Right? Your community has told us in many different ways that they'd like to see action in this area, that the status quo is not working.
Appreciated, thank you.
I think we know what we'll see if we don't do anything more and different. It'll get worse, and more people will be harmed.
Yeah, that's right. So with that, in our last few minutes, I'm going to turn this over. We created, alongside your community, we created this plan and this roadmap. It is now yours. We are here to support you. The Alliance is here to support you in the ways that you need. But I'm turning.
What's worse, homelessness or spiritual death? Think about that. I find that it's not the living you should be sad for.
And
but
we
the
want to
dead.
thank you very much for you and Josh, and for all the work you've done already and all the work you're going to do, because I know you're going to be back here tomorrow working with HIAC. So we appreciate that. And I think we're going to hear from Emily Ball next with the city of Asheville to help bring us to a close for today, just for today. Emily, you want to stand up there? Or you don't want to stand up there? No?
I'd
Okay,
be
you're-
pleased to sit if that works for you.
All right.
I want to again say thanks to Ann and Josh for this presentation and for all the time they've spent with our community. We have identified some next steps for the city and county, as well as the Homeless Initiative Advisory Committee, which you've heard a lot about today, HIAC, which is our Continuum of Care Board. So first, for the city and county, as the collaborative applicant for the Continuum of Care, which is currently the city of Asheville, our Homeless Strategy Division staff will be working with HIAC to evaluate the recommendations and develop action plans, which will likely include specific requests of both the city and the county. But again, as you've heard, that planning work really intended to happen through the Continuum of Care Board. Excuse me, Continuum of Care Board. On February 13th, some city, county, and HIAC leadership will be visiting emergency shelters in both Raleigh and Chapel Hill to understand what is working in those other communities effectively. City and county staff are also expected to participate in a Continuum of Care-led work group to develop an encampment resolution strategy, again, as you saw in the recommendations. We do anticipate that the city and county should anticipate increased funding requests to support the Continuum of Care's implementation of recommendations. And also that county leaders would be pursuing a budget process evaluation of the recommended additional staff position. For the Homeless Initiative Advisory Committee, Josh and Ann will be spending tomorrow in this room again with us, with HIAC for a retreat to really deep dive into the recommendations, unpack those a bit further. And then HIAC will be looking to develop a transition plan to build out the Continuum of Care structure. As you heard Josh say, that is a HIAC-driven process and decision-making process to fully build out that Continuum of Care structure and to evaluate and pursue action plans to implement the recommendations. And then also expecting that HIAC will be working with city and county staff to identify a process to update you all, city and county leaders, on that transition planning, action planning, on progress, and on needs.
So thanks for that, Emily. I mean, basically, are there any other slides we need to look at here? Okay. What I think we can expect in the very near future is the work that HIAC will do around the structure of the COC, and I see nodding on the, to tell us, what we need to do to move towards this recommendation about a COC that can be and do all the things that we've heard about today in this presentation, and work to bring our community together effectively to address this crisis. So thanks in advance, and also retroactively for all the things that you've been doing. I know the city and the county very much appreciate it. Commissioners, council members, we just have a couple remarks to close us out. I think Jasmine has a clarification on the phone number.
Just a quick clarification, that outreach, excuse me. Quick clarification, I made a mistake, let me correct myself. That outreach number is non-emergent and for partners and shelter organizations at this point. My apologies, and please note that, thanks.
Okay, so we are going to work on getting a number for general community use, hopefully, that Jasmine will give us as soon as we have that. But I do think right now our community paramedic system is tied in with our 911 system, so it is possible to call 911 and if you feel there's a situation you're looking at that the community paramedics may be able to address. So that's my understanding. Claire, nod your head at me if that's okay to say yes.
We're working
Every
with
time I
law
go by
enforcement
the
dispatch and
hospital,
stakeholders
going
to
to
figure out the least
I see
confusing way that works for
one
everybody. We just can't have an official alternative line until we have some more clarification. But
Gotcha, okay. Do you want to say anything here at this point?
Just to say thanks to, particularly to Ann and Josh for all your great work on this again, and great presentations today, super informative, a lot to process and think about. And thanks again to everyone who helped kind of put today's event together. And thanks to all the folks serving on HIAC. And as has been acknowledged, there's a lot of important work to move this ahead and think about these recommendations and how we translate these ideas into more effective action in the future. So, and thanks to all the county staff, just everyone who helped put this together today. We really look forward to working on moving this into the next phase of implementation.
And I think, and a special shout out to all of our service providers in our community that have been doing this hard work. And as the last couple of years have sort of unfolded and we've all gotten a chance to meet with different folks and learn about different programs, you get a couple of things that strike you. One is there's a great need for collaboration and communication, but that there is an overwhelming desire to serve the community in so many different ways, and we're lucky in Asheville to have that. So it would be disastrous if we were trying to figure out how to collaborate with a lack of providers, but we're fortunate to be working on how to coordinate and collaborate with an abundance of providers.
As a member of HIAC, can I say something?
Yes, please.
Get him a microphone?
Yeah, I'll speak into a microphone. What seems most critical here today, and as our friend who shared what's worse, homelessness or spiritual death, is that we have to continue to listen to those voices. Because I do believe Asheville is at a moment of spiritual death as a pastor. And we have to listen to these voices, and we have to prioritize the folks who are in proximity with these voices. Because if data is our aim, it will disappoint us, but these lived realities with this data can really change for the future. So it unsettles me to disrupt someone like the man who just spoke, because he is the prophet that we need in order to do with homelessness what needs to be done. Thank you.
Can I just add one point of clarification? So when we say data, that's qualitative and quantitative. So I just want to add to your point. So that is it, definitely including the qualitative, the voices for folks with lived experience with that data analysis. I just want to add that piece.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thanks again for everyone for participating, and I think we're adjourned.
You know, we have a little better now than we used to.
Hey.
You know,